Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're going to go ahead and get started as some people start to percolate in. If you are just joining us for the first time, I don't think anyone here is only one person. We have bathrooms right out the doors to the left and then another left into the hallway. In case of an emergency or an evacuation, we're going to step out these doors, down the stairs, and exit through the front door onto Cesar Chavez Park. If you are listening in online and you are on the internet, you may not be able to hear, so it won't matter what I'm saying to you. But if you're just joining, please call into the line and you'll be able to talk to us. In order to comment, you can use the raise your hand feature, and we will call on you, and at that time you can press *6 to unmute your line and talk to us here in the room, and when you're done talking, just push *6 once again to mute yourself again. Thank you all for coming. This is the last day of our series of workshops. My name is Ilanka Zlatar, and I've been helping out with 901 development of the regulations. So we're going to try to get through this today. This topic for this workshop is the targeted materials. So we're going to go through, sorry. If you are online right now and you can hear us, can you just give us a quick, actually press *6 to unmute yourself and let us know that you can hear us and we can hear you.
Hi. I can hear you. I can hear you.
Thank you. And if we could, yeah, that's it. Okay. So, sorry. Today, we're going to talk about, we're going to have two workshops. The first one is the targeted products and material types workshop, and then we're going to do general topics to open it up to any other topics that haven't been covered in the other workshops. So for this session, we're going to do some opening remarks, kind of remind you of the purpose of the law and some of the timelines. And we're going to have an open discussion about some of the topics that we would need some help with for the materials. So AB 901 was passed in 2015, and it is an attempt to get the state more information about the recycling, composting, and waste streams. Our current reporting is mostly limited to disposal, so everything that's going to landfill, and to certain programs that we have. So we actually don't have a lot of information on a lot of recycling activities. So this law attempts to cover all of the recycling and composting activities in the state. So some of the big changes is that we're trying to update and streamline the procedures, utilizing technology to make it easier for us to have less mistakes in the reporting, to improve the timeliness of the data, as well as to increase the amount of data that we do collect. So we're going to be using online reporting, notifications, and contacting. And all of the facilities are now going to be reporting directly to CalRecycle instead of going through jurisdictions and counties. So we're hoping this is going to improve the quality of the data that we're collecting. It's going to improve the quantity of the data. And this will in turn allow CalRecycle to focus its efforts as we move from our 50% mandates to our 75% statewide recycling goal. So as far as the timeline here, currently we're in our last round of informal workshops. We probably won't be holding any more informal workshops since we've already had 2 rounds, this being the 3rd. We're going to get some feedback from you guys, and depending on how long it takes for us to come out with a new draft and incorporate all of the comments that you provide us, we will then move on to the formal rulemaking process, which is governed by the Office of Administrative Law. And that process is a lot more strict. There's more strict deadlines and procedures and comment periods. We're hoping to start that process here at the end of 2016, hopefully by October if all goes well, but there's a lot of other variables, so we'll let you know how that timeline moves. We're hopefully going to complete the rulemaking process in 2017, and we're hoping to begin reporting in 2018. That's a pretty optimistic timeline, so we're hoping for your flexibility and patience on that. And we will be developing the online reporting system alongside the formal rulemaking process so that when we're done with the rulemaking, we can jump right into the online reporting. So today's topic, targeted products and material types. Sure. We have a few different categories. So we have what we call material categories, which is everything that we are hoping to get information from. So if you fall within one of the material categories that we specified in the draft regulations, which are mostly just your your traditional recyclables, your paper, glass, metals, plastics, as well as organics, compostable material, and then what we're calling this targeted products category, then we expect you to report. So within those categories, there's going to be material types that we want you to report on. And we're trying to make this as flexible and user-friendly as possible. So for industry, we're asking that you report at the level that the material leaves your facility. So when we're talking material types, just as a reminder, we're just talking about recycling. When you're transporting solid waste, that's just solid waste, and you report that as a disposal activity, you don't have to report material type on that. So the material types are exclusively for recycling materials that are going for recycling or composting. So the materials leaving a recycling facility should be reported at the level of separation that they are sold. So for example, if you're a MRF and you have a mixed load of paper that contains white ledger and mixed paper and newsprint and everything, you would report a load of mixed paper. But if that paper is white ledger, then we want you to report it's a bale of white ledger. So we're trying to make it flexible so that you don't have to go into your breaking bales or approximating what percent is of what type of thing, but we still have enough information from the people who do have that kind of separation. So with that in mind, do we have any kind of comments on that specific topic of how does that feel? How does that work for you guys, having this kind of flexibility? Do we have any comments in the room or online about that point?
So go ahead and turn the mic on, just push the button on the side. It'll sort of start flashing green instead of red.
Okay. This is Graham Noyes, represents some companies that are producers of low carbon fuels in particular. And actually this is just a question as to whether now is the right time to talk about what these target categories are, or if that's further back in the presentation.
We can talk about that a little bit later if anybody has comments about this. But if not, we can address that topic now. Does anyone have comments about the level of specificity that we're looking for? Does that sound workable for people? Larry, go ahead. And then we'll take Veronica after Larry.
Not sure if I do or do not have comments as Larry Sweetser for the rural counties yet. And I think it depends more after we get into it on what material types and things. So maybe we can come back to that question after we figured out some of the other parts.
Sure. Veronica?
Veronica here, CRC. I do notice your last bullet is what happens if CalRecycle or another governmental entity is already collecting some data associated with one of the material types or targeted products. And in your creation of the database, anything that could overlap so it's not duplicative, you know, in terms of paint. I'm just thinking of things like paint, carpet, mattresses, e-waste. I mean, the list is kind of extensive. These kind of more EPR programs that many of us are already doing reporting for. It would be wonderful to have some overlap so that folks aren't doing too much reporting.
Yeah, and we definitely hear you there. We are trying to work with the other folks in our department that run those programs to see where information can be reported once and then used for several purposes. But at the same time, as you probably already know, there's different requirements from the different laws as to what needs to be reported. So that the things that maybe the e-waste program needs for their reimbursements is different kind of information than what AB 901 would require. But we are working with the IT department and with other folks in the department to try to make that as integrated as possible. But, you know, we can't say right now how much of that is going to mesh or isn't because, you know, some of the databases are a lot older or may not be compatible with a new database. But we do hear you, and we are trying to integrate as much as possible. So, yeah.
So Jill Rodby has her hand up. If you want to press *6 and unmute yourself, you can ask your question or give your comment.
Okay. Yes, I was wondering on the source reporting when it leaves your facility. I mean, most metal recyclers are processing cars and white goods and whatever, but it all ends up in bulk loads going into ship holds. How do you see us reporting that?
Why don't you take that, Robert?
Right. So again, this would sort of be. It depends on what the nature of the material that's leaving. If it's mixed metals, then you would report mixed metals. If you're sending out some aluminum and some steel, then you would report 100 tons of aluminum and 500 tons of steel. So if it's, you know, I don't know, crushed appliances and it's just a mix of plastic and steel and aluminum and whatever have you, then you'd sort of say that. We're really looking to try to find a way to get information of what's actually happening. We don't want people to try to figure out what's in that shipment, what's in that bale, and figure out it's 20% steel and 15% aluminum and 30% plastic. Just tell us what it actually is. If it's crushed cars or crushed appliances, tell us that. If it's steel, tell us that. If it's mixed scrap, tell us that. So that's how we would see it going. Does that answer your question, Jill?
Yeah, so if we had cars and other iron goods mixed together, the cars were already shredded, then it would all be mixed metals, is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's probably what we would say. I mean, you know, we'd like to run parallel to how you're actually marketing it. So if you're selling it to whoever it is who's going to buy it from you, if you're selling it as mixed metals, then tell us it's mixed metals. If you're selling it as cars, then report it as cars.
Okay.
But yeah, basically, we want to take advantage of however it is you're tracking it already. So just one, because it helps us to understand the flow of material actually as it occurs through the system in the form that it occurs. So that's helpful for us to know how this works. But we also want to make this as relatively simple as possible. So to take advantage of how you're already tracking and characterizing these materials so that it's not an additional characterization effort for you. It's just a matter of taking what's already being tracked and just providing it to CalRecycle.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So on that same note, the way that we define these material types, we need some help in that definition also. So we probably have an idea of what we track based on like the waste characterization study, for example, like the types of materials that we're thinking of providing. But that being said, we want to make this as useful and friendly to the industry as possible, in that if you're already tracking, like Robert said, if you're already tracking things at an industry kind of spec level, then we would need some help in using the same terminology that you guys are using and how you are defining those terms. So if there's, if number 1 plastic is what you're calling it, or if it's PET, or if you're commonly shipping out 1s and 2s or 3 through 7, or, however you are commonly shipping these things out, is how we want to build a database so that you can report it that way. So I would like to ask of all of you in your own industry if you could send us a list of how you are selling your product as far as the material type, what name you're using, and how you define that in terms of percent contamination, or if there's kind of a grade A and grade B depending on that contamination level. If you could provide that to us so that we can parallel the way that you guys are shipping things out to make the reporting more simple and to inform CalRecycle as to how things are happening on the field. And we do have a hand up online. Brian Matthews, you can unmute yourself with *6.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
So a couple questions. One is on section X6, page 7, under solid waste for use on site for beneficial reuse. A disposal facility shall not report the use of clean or contaminated soil segregated prior to receipt by a landfill. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us why that is?
Yeah, I'm going to hand it over to John Sitz to answer that question.
So in the regulations for disposal reporting as it is now, soil and contaminated soil are not listed because they're simply cover for materials used. So soil is daily cover. Soil is intermediate cover.
But they're listed on the BOE reports, so they're tracking that. Why would you not track it?
Well, we were specifically looking at alternative daily cover and alternative intermediate cover being from waste-derived sources. I think when you look at other parts of you're right, BOE form does include soil, but it's one of those things that we have not included. It's not included in the definition of AIC or AUC. And I think part of it comes down to a lot of soil can be used, that soil that's already in place on site and is moved around and things like that. So I think...
So we strongly object or feel that you should be tracking that. All the landfills are tracking it already. It's a data point you should be tracking as well. It becomes a big loophole for material to flow through that no fees apply to. We've had, and we've shared with CalRecycle, evidence of fraud at landfills where the material is classified as a soil-type product and no fees are applied, and it turns out it's C&D material or MRF fines or some other material, and they're classifying it as soil. Oh, well, we didn't have to report that. And if you're not getting the data point, you wouldn't even know that it's missing. It seems kind of putting on blinders. You should be tracking that. On the contaminated soil, there's two types of contaminated soil. There's soil that's contaminated with hydrocarbons that the regional board allows to be used as cover, and then there's profiled soils that have to be buried. That's actual disposal. So you've got soil that it still show up as soil, and so somebody would say, oh, well, I didn't report that because you said I didn't have to report contaminated soil. Well, this was contaminated soil that was so contaminated I had to bury it. Well, then again, you've created a loophole for, heirs. I'm sure the companies themselves are not intentionally, trying to defraud, but they've had, employee issues at scale houses where this has occurred, and I think that it's, important that you include it in the reporting requirements. The other is that, again, back to the material types, I think that CalRecycle should come up with a list of material descriptions, if you will. There's MSW. Some people use mixed debris. Some use general debris. Some use the word trash. And are they all the same? Are they all different? C&D, concrete with rebar. Each has its own characteristic. I think that you could probably get a list from, the major players, Waste Management, Republic, Ecology, Waste Connections, are probably the bigger ones, LA Sand. They could probably give you a list of materials types as they characterize stuff coming in on weight tickets, and then you say, okay, look, we're going to use MSW means all these other three as well. So you kind of have a way of determining what is being used for beneficial reuse and what is, a disposal category.
Brian, I've got a few things to add to that. This is Robert. First, to the point that you were asking about the soils, the section that you're referencing is under the solid waste used on site for beneficial reuse. So any soil that goes into the landfill for disposal, just like any other sort of municipal solid waste, anything that goes in the hole for disposal has to be reported under A1, because anything for disposal has to be reported. But we don't take material types for material that gets disposed. So if the material is capable of being used on site for beneficial reuse, and it is clean or contaminated soil that's segregated prior to receipt by the landfill, then is when X.6.2b comes into play, where it's saying that that you don't have to report clean or contaminated soil that's segregated prior to receipt by the landfill that is suitable for use for beneficial reuse on site at the landfill. But everything that goes into the hole has to be reported no matter what it is. That being
But
said,
that's a distinction you're making that isn't a distinction that is always followed at the landfill, because they're getting in soil. The guy up at the face of the landfill, he doesn't know how it's been classified at the scale house, whether it was segregated beforehand, and it goes into the hole or it goes into their stockpile for using on the landfill. It isn't, you don't have that distinction being made at the operating face of the landfill. And so it has to be made at the scale house, and by saying, well, we're not going to take it if it's been used if it's going to be for beneficial reuse, you don't know that until after it's left the scale. It may end up in the hole, or it may end up in a stockpile past the scale. Until you have recorded that data point, you're basically saying, don't record it at all, even though the decision to use it as cover or bury it may occur after the scale house.
We might have to have a little bit of more thinking on this, but I think there is a little bit of a distinction between what we're requiring to be reported versus how landfills are being operated, and if a landfill is currently being operated in a way that doesn't necessarily allow or make for convenient, accurate reporting, that's not necessarily a cogent argument for changing the regulations. The requirements are that a landfill must report everything that gets disposed in the landfill in one way, total tons, and it must report all of the material used on site for beneficial reuse in a different way, i.e. by material type and use type. And it's really falls to the landfill to figure out how to make sure that they're doing that right. There are a lot of other reporting requirements that they have to make for the beneficial reuse. They wouldn't necessarily fall just to soil. If you come up to the gate and you don't know if it's going in the hole or if it's going for beneficial reuse, that's not specific to soil. That's for everything. That could just as well apply to wood waste or...
I understand, but what you're saying here is that this category of beneficial reuse, as it relates to soil, doesn't need to be reported. And yet, just prior to that, you just said that anything that's by material type for beneficial reuse does need to be recorded,
except for
soil.
Except for clean or contaminated soil that's segregated prior to coming to the landfill.
But everything is segregated prior to coming to landfill. They're
But
not
if it's
segregating soil.
If it's soil and it's segregated prior to coming to the landfill, then it is not material destined for the landfill that's being used for beneficial reuse. It's material coming in for engineering projects or for daily cover or for anything else, as if they were to buy a truckload of soil from someplace.
Well, there's your distinction. If they're paying for it, then it doesn't need to be reported. But
no, if it's soil that's contaminated or clean and segregated prior to arrival at the landfill, it doesn't need to be reported.
I understand what you're saying the regulation says right now. I'm saying that there's a flaw there because you're creating a big loophole for which a lot of material can flow through, and you're ignoring it.
Brian,
the regulation is ignoring it.
Thank you for bringing that up. I think that we do need to maybe set up another call with you or maybe some emails about the issue and give it some more thoughts. But let's go ahead and move on so we can get to the other topics that we need to talk about today.
The other topic that I brought up was you should have a material class that everybody reports the same thing. So if it's MSW from multifamily, commercial, whatever, it's MSW. It's a common used term across all reporting. So
yeah, and
you're not trying to...
So as a reminder for disposal, so anything that's going to landfill, you don't have to report material type. So it doesn't matter what we call it. Right now it is MSW, municipal solid waste, that's has to be reported, but it's just tons disposed. So there's actually no material type there. However, we do have a mixed waste category for things that are leaving a MRF or recycling for recycling. So for example, if a MRF is sending mixed waste to another MRF, then they do have to report material type. So in that case, we do need to define the terms, whether we're going to use MSW or mixed waste with recyclables or whatever. In that case, we do need to define those terms, but in the case of landfills, we actually don't need to define the term because they're not going to have to. I mean, we need to define it to say you have to report it, but they don't actually have to define the material when they report. They just say this is the number of tons that were disposed in the landfill.
Well, that's correct for the disposal reporting system. But for landfill operations and for local jurisdictions who are asking for records, we need them to define the material type as it comes in because in some cases fees apply, in some cases fees don't. So for example, hazardous asbestos versus non-hazardous asbestos. Fees apply to non-hazardous asbestos. They do not apply to hazardous asbestos. So you're losing granularity by saying, oh, well, they don't have to report the type of material that's being brought in because that type of material helps you understand how that material is being used.
Brian, I'd agree with you that there is some benefit to getting material type for what's going into a landfill. However, the statute doesn't give us the authority to collect that data. The statute gives us authority to collect tons going to landfill for disposal, and it gives us the authority to collect tons by material type for material leaving recycling or composting facilities. But those two are separate, and we really don't have the ability to require disposal facilities to report on the material type coming into their facility for disposal. and really there's no way around that for us. I mean, facilities can obviously provide data to us on a voluntary basis if they like, but we don't have the authority to require that of them.
So the statute does require them to track this information for local jurisdictions on the weight tickets. And what I'm saying is that if you're saying, oh, we don't have to track that, and they stop putting this information on weight tickets, then local jurisdictions are losing that granularity that we need to do it. So I don't want you to undermine the local jurisdictions. And it's in statute right now. It didn't replace the whole CIWMB's or CalRecycle's rulemaking on what landfills need to track. This is just the disposal reporting piece of it.
This is John Sitz again. Yeah, the purposes and scope of AB 901 isn't everything reporting. You're right, Brian. It has very specific purposes and limits. We're not saying people can't collect other data or that other parts of information can't be tracked, and that it changes everything about how landfills report information to the Board of Equalization or anything else. We're not saying any of that. This is specific to AB 901. As Alanka said at the beginning, we'd love to have industry and facilities tell us different material types that they use or give us ideas. Currently, the regulations talk about material category, and then we say, if you get it more specific, report more specifically. So we'd love to be able to put a list together that says, for residuals, some people use the term solid waste residual, some people use this, some people use that. We could have a list that says residuals means the following or whatever else that meets these criteria, so that it's clear to everybody. I think we want it to be clear to everybody. But
I guess maybe you should tell me where you think 901 does not say you can collect type.
It's not so much that 901 says we can't, but it doesn't say we can. Statutory authority for us is permissive. So we're given permission or authority to get something. And if it doesn't say that we can do it, then that sort of means we can't. 901 tells us to get tons of material that's sent to a disposal facility for disposal. And it tells us we can get material type and tons for material that leaves a recycling or compost facility. But because it's silent on the material type for disposal, it implies that that was never the intention to get material type for material going to a landfill for disposal.
And Brian, when we set up the online reporting tool and during the regulation development, we can definitely say, and I think we do say, MSW, municipal solid waste, you need to report all municipal solid waste disposed. And so that in itself is giving you a term. Now, you can't break it down further than that. Just anything that's going into the landfill is going to be municipal solid waste. So I'm not really sure as to where exactly you're wanting more specificity. Can you maybe explain that a little bit?
Yeah, we don't charge our fee on other waste, okay? And if everything is being classified as MSW, then our fee could be applied to tonnage that is inadvertently described as MSW, but in fact, it was MRF fines that could be used for ADC. And therefore, we would be implying our fee erroneously and wouldn't be able to make the distinction, because now a landfill operator saying, well, I'm just calling everything MSW that isn't soil or, brush.
No, landfills are required to report any material used for beneficial use on site, including ADC and AIC by material.
You didn't hear what I just said, though. I said they classified it as MSW, but the hauler is saying, well, I was taking a MRF fines that was used for ADC.
If they put it in the hole, then it's classified as disposal, not as beneficial reuse, and it doesn't matter what it's called.
Okay, but Robert, you're not hearing me. Oftentimes, materials are misclassified, okay, as disposal or conversely as other.
But
okay?
Brian,
until you talk to a hauler, you don't know what they were taking to the facility.
But in that case, if the hauler is misrepresenting it, there's nothing that we can change in the names that's going to make them not misrepresent it.
And I'm just going to step in here, Brian,
Not
and
the
just to
hauler
keep the
that's
conversation
misrepresenting it.
going on track. I'd like to just maybe take this conversation offline so that we, can continue with the workshop, but then we can continue with this conversation just on our own so that we can make sure that we get it to everybody else's thoughts as well. So we've got a comment here in the room. If you want to grab one of those wireless mics, just turn the button on.
Kathy, you got me? Okay. Kathy Lynch. I have a variety of clients, but CRRC, and it occurred to me when Veronica was talking about other different tracks for like e-waste and mattresses, that I also worked on the treated wood waste disposal legislation, which has its own management standards, is segregated from construction and other demolition debris, has its own management standards. Do you envision that in this program? Because there's a whole different set of priorities for that. So that's a question. And to that point, I think as much as you can keep things that already have a system in place out of the mix here, that's going to be beneficial. We've been talking to folks, and the reporting requirements, if there's different reporting and forms, it's going to get very confusing. You're going to have a lot of data errors. And so one of the consistent things we're hearing is that folks would like you to do the due diligence of combining all those reports and establishing a simple database. So they don't mind putting in some of the material data. What they do object to is trying to figure out all the calculations and all that, because that's going to require the extra staff and everything that becomes quite burdensome. So that's just, we're hoping that you can either get the resources or do the database before we get too deep into this. I think that these are great workshops. I appreciate the outreach very much. But I've tried to get the word out as much as I can to various brokers and others. But as you know, the unregulated community isn't as engaged with CalRecycle, and by the looks of the room and everything, I still don't think you have the right people here for some of the target products you're looking at. I think it would be extremely valuable to all the parties, particularly when you're going into formal rulemaking, to not surprise sectors and to put together a list of those targets that you believe. Do your homework on that and tell us what you think is in the system and publish that, and then do some outreach to those sectors, because I still don't think they're in the room. And then I had a question
Kathy,
around...
Can I interrupt just a minute? Just because I'm going to forget all of the first questions by the time you get to the end.
Okay.
So,
treated wood.
Yeah, treated wood. Let me just respond really quickly. So treated wood, we weren't planning on keeping sort of treated wood as a separated, different kind of tracked material,
Is that
unless...
just disposed, or is it recycled?
It's disposed separately. It has to be source separated at the landfill.
So anything that is disposed won't have a category type at all associated with it. So it could be treated wood, or it could be refrigerators, or it could be plastic, or
things
mixed,
coming
or whatever.
in that are treated wood that get segregated at the landfill don't need to have...
Anything that goes in the hole is just treated all as one mix. If it's going to be recycled or it's going to be composted, now we're talking about material types. And now we're talking about, should we separate out tracking treated wood versus untreated wood versus green waste versus food waste, et cetera. But if it's really just going to disposal, there's no material type associated with it.
And then the data, sort of the blending of all the different programs that you already have that have a practice, such as mattresses and paint and waste. And,
yeah, and as Alanka said, we're going to do what we can.
And I know that's been raised, but trying to blend a single report of these programs will be critical, and having a simple database. I know you've done really good work on your waste characterization database that you rolled out your last monthly meeting. Quite impressed with that. But we're hoping that that can be a foundational piece of this. And then and then obviously the other point that I had was to really do even more outreach to the targeted sectors by coming up with the actual list and then publishing that maybe at a monthly meeting and then getting out to those sectors.
So I'd like to speak to that really quickly because we've been doing a fair amount of work with that. We've created a list of it was around 3,500 emails based on sort of searches through our Swiss database, our Facet database, Doris, and a number of our internal databases, and then some just sort of boots on the ground, doing some internet searches, who deals with plastics in California, who's, PET industry representatives, who deals with C&D, who deals with food, on and on. And we got another, 80 or so out of that of sort of industry organizations rather than specific facilities. We can check with folks just to make sure that none of the data that is in there is confidential to see if we can post it. What would be really great is if folks have, people that they think are going to be involved in this that haven't been around, and let us know who they are or forward on the info so they can sign up for the listserv. There are, each of these workshops have had between 50 and 100 online participants, so I know you don't see them here in the room, but we have a number of people participating in the process, just not, here face to face. But it's really important for us, and we really want to make sure that everybody who will be impacted is involved. We have maybe 650 people on our listserv, and again, those 3,500 or so people we've been sending sort of blind emails out to, letting them know the workshops, the draft regs, how to sign up for the listserv, and how to engage. Obviously, we can't make people engage, but we'd like to make sure that we've got the right people on that list. We'll check to see whether we can, what we can publish publicly, but certainly if anyone has any thoughts, hey, there's this person that should be here, I don't know why they're not, send us their email or send our emails on to them and let them decide if they'd like to engage.
Thank you for that. I think what would be helpful, I appreciate that you can't publish trade associations, et cetera, but just a list would perk up those industries. So I'm sure paint and mattresses and some of those folks don't really realize they're impacted here because they have their own pathways. So just posting kind of a standard list. And I'm certainly going to put your name out there to some trade associations, or maybe you come over and present to them and let them know. But again, they're going to then ask, well, are auto dismantlers in this program or not? So I really believe you're going to have to ping them with that information. And then my last point, and thank you for your indulgence, was I know at the Diamond Bar workshop on AB 901, there was a pretty interesting conversation around procurement practices in California, and that was flagged as an issue. And there hasn't been a lot of conversation about how state agencies and others will report as well. So, Caltrans comes to mind and others that do dispose. So maybe you could address that as well. Thank you.
Well, I would say that we are very aware, keenly aware of the procurement issue, and there are laws on the books about state procurement that maybe haven't been followed as well as they should have. However, the reason why that didn't come up in the workshop is because the purpose of this legislation and the rulemaking isn't really to make state government, follow suit with what they're supposed to be purchasing, but we're trying to develop the rulemaking for whatever is getting used. So whatever the, if there are products that are being processed here in California, then we will get that information, but our authority doesn't really extend to what products are being purchased in this legislation. So there's not much we can do to kind of track that through 901. I'm sure that there are other laws that may allow for kind of that information, but 901, that is kind of outside of its jurisdiction, its extent.
And I'll also add that a number of state agencies, even local jurisdictions, they do, and federal agencies generate waste. And they may send it off for disposal or have it picked up by a hauler for recycling, just like a business would. But the way that the regs are written, generators of waste are not reporters. So if you're generating even large amounts, as say Caltrans generating material that goes off-site for disposal, or if it goes off-site for recycling, they wouldn't be considered a reporting entity under 901. It would be the facility that receives it. So the landfill would report that material if it's being disposed, or the recycling or compost facility would report that material if they're processing it. And then just before we move off the topic, there was a comment online, Robin Harger. They were just talking about treated wood being reported as a whole number going to landfill. Will we still be doing the treated wood reports twice a year? I'm not sure exactly what the treated wood reports are. It's not something that I'm involved with, but 901 reporting won't impact other reporting obligations. So if you have to report treated wood waste twice a year for some other program, whether CalRecycle or otherwise, those will still continue post 901. 901 is really all about sort of new, different reporting, but if you have to tell CalRecycle for some other program about treated wood waste or PET bottles or compost or what have you, those reporting obligations will remain unchanged moving forward. Go ahead,
We have a couple comments in the room. I did want to point out that this is the list of targeted products that we have in the first draft of the regs. And if you guys have any comments about what is in and what is out as far as this list here, we did talk to some other folks in the department asking if the information that they were getting from current reporting on some of these items was sufficient, was good enough, was giving us the information that we wanted to have, and these were kind of the list that we came up with that we decided we weren't getting enough information. So with that, let's take a question here, Veronica.
Veronica, CRC, just to clarify about the generator issue. So in the case of mattresses, a retailer who picks up a mattress from a generator at the point, so you buy a new mattress, they'll pick up your old mattress, and they're part of this, the EPR program for mattress recycling. So they're the retailer, but they've actually done the process of capturing the mattresses from the generator, in this case the original customer and purchaser of the product. Where would something like a retailer in that case, like a Macy's or Sears, be in this on this list? Do you consider them a generator and therefore they wouldn't report, or would they be reporting what mattresses are sending to recycling?
Very good question. I don't know that we've thought to that level on that specific stream, because it's kind of a new one and it's still kind of getting its feet on the ground. But
I'd say that it depends a little bit on what they're doing. So, a lot of 901 reporting it's activity-based rather than facility-based, right? So it matters less that they're a retailer, and it matters more what they're doing with it. So if they're going out and delivering a mattress and picking up the old one, and at the end of the day, they've got a truck full of old mattresses, and they swing by the mattress recycling place and they dump their truck and they go back to their warehouse for the night, they're a hauler, right? So haulers, for the most part, and in this situation, no reporting obligation. They wouldn't be considered the generator, because that would be the homeowner who's generating the mattress, but they're the hauler. But they're delivering it to a mattress processing facility, whether they actually tear them apart or they're just consolidating them and shipping them off later. The Sears would sort of be the hauler. If, however, Sears brings all of those mattresses back to their warehouse and they stockpile them, and they've got 100 tons of mattresses that stock up over the course of a quarter, and then they send those mattresses off in bulk to a processing facility to tear them apart and separate the materials, then they might fall under the category of a processor, because they handle a covered category, mattresses. But again, the sort of threshold would come into play. So if they're only accumulating 10 or 12 mattresses at a time, or 5 tons a quarter at a time of mattresses, then they might not reach the threshold of needing to report at all. In which case, the next sort of facility up the line that receives the mattresses from Sears, they would have to report. And not knowing exactly how all the Sears and Home Depots and such of the world operate, it's hard to sort of give a blanket, all of them will be in or all of them will be out. But generally speaking, they're probably, for the most part, going to be out, because I doubt most of the Sears are wanting to have hundreds of old used mattresses piled up in their their warehouses at a time. But I don't know, maybe they do.
Well, it sounds like this speaks to the threshold issue, which we talked about the first day, and what thresholds might be under different material categories, and I think that'll be important here. But also, I think it also speaks to some of the nuances of maybe folks that should be in the room that aren't in the room, or maybe shouldn't be in the room, and so I think there's a little clarity needed there, an expansion on this list, and a little bit of a deeper dive, especially in the targeted materials, because I think we can point to the traditional recyclable streams and have a pretty clear understanding. But when we get into e-waste and, what does it look like if the community has an e-waste drop-off day, or even textiles, what is the role of recycling or reuse at now the name's escaping me, but, the mattresses sometimes go to, sorry, I'm
Like a Salvation Army, Goodwill
Salvation
kind
Army,
of thing?
thank you.
Yeah.
Something to that effect, where they may be reselling some items, but they may also be sending textiles for refurbishment or recycling. And I really think the targeted materials list is going to need a deeper dive into who's in and who's out, and whether or not it makes sense to include some of these products. So thank you for your time.
And just to follow up on that really quick, reuse activities are not included. So this would only be for things that are sent for recycling. So if they're baling up textiles and sending them to a rag factory where it's going to be, broken down and turned into something different, then we would like to capture that flow. If it's being sent out of the state to, developing countries to clothe people, then that would be out because it would be considered reuse. So again, that's going to be difficult, and we've tried to reach out to some of those players and we haven't gotten as much response. So that if you have any contacts that you think of who in light of this conversation should be involved, and you should definitely point them our way, because we have sent out kind of broad emails and haven't gotten the best response from those players. So thank you. We had another comment here.
And we also have one online, so when this one's finished.
Neil Edgar with Edgar & Associates. I'll go back and make a pitch I brought up the first day of the workshops is specifying wood waste as a category. I think Vanka had nailed it down as we're talking about specific commodities that are being moved out of recycling facilities. Nobody at a recycling facility, or not much, is being moved out of a recycling facility that's categorized as green waste or lumber or agricultural waste, which is the way it's categorized in the waste characterization studies. So be careful not to be too wedded to those existing classifications and really look at what's being moved in the marketplace.
What would be your suggestions for organics as far as material types?
Well, I'd look at, organic products consist of, wood waste specifically is moved out of both C&D facilities and other types of chip and grind operations. Some chip and grind operations take in lumber from C&D. They take in pallets, they take in green waste and screen out the green part of it to procure that wood because it's always had value. And that value has plummeted over the last couple of years. But being that it comes from a variety of sources, including agricultural waste, on the outbound, it's a different commodity. And then there's mulch products, soil amendments, compost. Probably those are the four largest categories.
So you're probably pretty familiar with the compost regulations, right, that came out. How do you feel about those definitions? How do you feel about the definitions used there, the vegetative material and...
I think the definitions that are in that are based on the expected received materials and don't have necessarily a bearing on outbound materials.
Right.
So looking at most of the classifications that have taken place in the past, it was all based on what's incoming to a facility, but doesn't have as much bearing on what the outbound products are. So you're correct in getting, what level of granularity that you want to get to on outbound paper products from MRFs. Do you want to get down to, and plastic materials? Do you want number one, number two, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 individually, or 3 through 7, or mixed plastics, film plastic, hard plastic. It really comes down to what level of specificity we're looking at. But we need to look more at that end of it as opposed to what we've traditionally looked at in classification of materials as inbound materials, because products are not the same and you can't track them equivalently.
So in what you just told me was 4 categories: wood waste, soil amendment, compost, and what was the last one?
Mulch.
Mulch. All right. So wood waste is different from mulch.
Wood waste is much different than mulch. Wood waste is typically the woody fraction that's sent off as to biomass plants. Generally, mulch may be material that it could be the same, but it could be composted mulch that's sent off to agricultural operations for use in their as a product. It's completely separate. It could be uncomposted green mulch that's used for landscaping. We can look at that a little more carefully, but
yeah, I appreciate that. Just
sizing matters.
Just to clarify how we envision, based on the current writing of the regs, if a facility is sending out a mix of wood waste and grass clippings and food waste, say, it's just some big mix of wet, gross organics, right? Some wood, some grass, some food. Then they would sort of report just mixed organics. If the next facility then sort of sorts it out and they are able to pull out, say, the food and the grass clippings to send off to one use, and they've got this leftover wood waste, whether it be branches or chips or stumps or whatever have you, and they send that off someplace else, what they would report is maybe mixed organics for the food and grass clippings and whatever else is over there, and wood waste going this direction by tons on each. That's how it currently sits. At least our envision. Maybe the wording doesn't spell that out well, but is that something that you think addresses your concerns, or is there still another level where you feel like, that first transport, they should be able to spell out that, this big mix is so much wood and so much food and so much grass clippings?
No, I think, you just brought up three additional categories, but I think they're in that scenario, you're talking about materials that arrive at a MRF. And then the MRF separates out the mixed organic stream from the wood material and sends that on for further processing. The wood goes to, may go to a chip and grinder that sends material to biomass, and the organics go to the composting facility that then screens it out. I don't know, in the organics world, there probably aren't many operations where you're going to see more than 2 levels of processing, as opposed to plastics where you may see 4 or 5 levels.
Right.
So I think in that case, you're not going to have a huge number of categories, but wood is derived out of mixed C&D operations as well, and given that there's this pretty significant crisis in the movement of wood, and it's one of the largest commodities that is identified in the disposal stream, both in terms of lumber and green waste, where it doesn't really get broken down into what the woody portion of those are. It bears handling it as a separate commodity, but it does get into the question of the whole level of granularity across the material streams, not just with organics, but the other MRFed materials as well.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Can I take a question online? We've got a question from Glenn Acosta. Why is there a need to speciate to the extent on your list? If there is an EPR program for an item, why is reporting to CalRecycle necessary? It seems that reporting categories should be EPR HHW and non-EPR HHW. So, this is, I think it's a good conversation to have. We're talking about what level of information we need, what level of material types are we talking about. We wanted to, we're not planning on taking information for all HHW materials. We've got a fairly small list of specific EPR type materials and specific HHW type materials, mostly because the data that's being captured either under the EPR program or variously under the HHW programs that collect some data don't give us the same kind of data that we would get under AB 901, and the data that we get under AB 901 we feel would be beneficial to CalRecycle's programs. That being said, we still have the opportunity to talk about whether something like architectural paint should be in, or whether mattresses should be in, or whether carpet should be in. Like Ilanka mentioned, we've talked about this internally with the folks who manage these programs, and there's a little bit of back and forth, and some people think that there is benefit to having more information about what happens to mattresses or to electronic devices beyond covered electronic devices, or batteries, or paint, or waste tires. And so we've included them in this list because there are folks who believe that there's some benefit to that beyond what's being collected already through either Form 303 or the EPR programs or other means. But if you have some specific thoughts about one or more of these, rather than just lumping them all together, if we want to talk about paint, or we want to talk about waste tires or household batteries, let's talk about the pros and cons of the data that's already being gathered versus the data that we would be able to get under AB 901. So we've got some folks raising their hands in the room.
For example, does anybody know of any furniture recyclers in the state? Who breaks down furniture and does anything with it? Yeah, question.
Aaron Danhoff, Chilton Solid Waste. My question actually is pretty specific, and maybe this is not the right venue for that, but as far as used tires or waste tires, it's a pretty extensively covered item already. I already send 2 separate reports to CalRecycle covering everything from the address from where we pick them up to the address where we I'm just kind of curious, is that something maybe past where we handle this to the people who actually do the recycling, but, and then send it on after that, or is it something in between that you're going to ask for more information?
Yeah, so basically, all of these materials, if they do make it into the final list, they would be treated like anything else. So if you're handling waste tires and you're sending them off to a processor, then you would basically say the same information you would for plastics. I sent 100 tons of waste tires to facility X, and then that would be it. But then that facility, then, if they're going to cut the sidewalls off and sell those, and they're going to grind up the tires and pull out the steel and the fiber, then they'll have a flow of rubber, and they'll have a flow of steel, and they'll have a flow of fiber, and they'll have a flow of tire sidewalls going out to further recycling or use out in the industry. And I think that really sort of represents the level of granularity that is missing currently.
You're looking more for what happens after it gets delivered to a recycler, what happens with the product after it's disassembled.
I mean, I think that's the missing piece of the puzzle, right? So, I mean, as you say, we are getting a fair amount of information for tires that go from the point of generation or collection to the first level processor. But beyond that, things start to get a little bit more ambiguous, a little bit more black hole-y, and sort of understanding and be able to track what's going on, how much residual is coming out of these facilities, what kinds of things are going and where. That's a part of the puzzle that we don't necessarily have as much information about. And then some waste tires might come into a facility and then sort of find their way into a landfill, either for ADC or some other engineering type product or purpose. And those flows, again, would be helpful to sort of see where they're coming from.
Thank you.
And as we look at each of these materials, these targeted materials especially, if you see, in your operations, well, we're already reporting at these level of facilities, but yet we don't report at this other level of facilities. I mean, these are very specific materials. We could look at saying, up to this point is covered by the tire manifest system. So these facilities are excluded, and these other ones have to report. I mean, if you have suggestions like that, make them. because, we can look and see what makes sense, and nobody's interested in having multiple sets of reports that say the same thing, or worse, that say different things for what should be the same. So, help us work through that and figure out what makes sense for each of those. And some of those may be like, well, this is the two pieces of information that's missing. Can we incorporate them in the other reporting, or can we do a unified form, or there are other approaches. So yeah, if you have suggestions, you guys know how you handle stuff and how you deal with stuff. Let us know, and because we want to work through that too.
So this is Graham Noyes again, and this conversation has been really helpful in sort of understanding the objectives, and the specific recommendation that I want to make is to include essentially feedstock for transportation fuel as a new target category here. And I think a little context is necessary to explain why that's worth doing. One thing that's the timing is kind of interesting here, because this really has not mattered. This hasn't been happening out there to a significant degree. We're just now seeing commercialization.
Someone unmuted their line. Would you please press *6 to mute your line again? Sorry.
Okay, thanks. And so we are now seeing a whole group of facilities, and a good example is Fulcrum Bioenergy, that's actually taking some MSW type streams out of the California streams now and bringing them out to a feedstock processing unit that's in the Reno area. I think they're taking about 10 tons a day now. That unit is already operational. It's basically chopping them up, running them through magnets, picking up more recyclables than could normally be caught within the normal processing stream. And then the plan is, and this is not operational yet, the back end of the facility is going to be a gasification unit that's then going to be used ultimately to produce a liquid Fischer-Tropsch diesel fuel. And so this is kind of a different category than everything else we've talked about, because it's probably going to be really heterogeneous in terms of what it is. But why it matters to the industry is really recognizing that there's this volume of material that's going into transportation fuel applications, knowing where to put that, and knowing that, that might be material that, would be going into a disposal situation typically, and not all of these facilities are the same. So it's not going to be that we just have one, it's more of an end-use situation than a nature of the material situation. But I do think it's important for the industry.
The conference is now in talk mode. What? The conference is now in silent mode.
Great. Thanks, Robert. Yes, we have thrown that idea back and forward because of the current way that the legislation is structured. There isn't really a lot of opportunity for things that are gasification or that kind of activity to be considered a recycling stream. And maybe John can talk a little bit more about where that stands currently, because we think that it would be great to have a differentiation. However, the law right now doesn't really allow for it.
Well, and I'll kind of step back into the categories that we're reporting in on the recycling and composting side for AB 901 is material sent to an end use in state, material sent for disposal, material sent to another processing facility in state, and then the last one is material exported out of California. So if you're in this situation, you're talking about material going to a facility in Reno, so that would be reported as material leaving the state. So the broker or the transporter taking that material out would report that this is some kind of a mixed material, it sounds like. So either mixed recyclables or mixed solid waste, this many tons going there. So depending on the nature of the processing at the end and kind of the collection at the beginning, if you're talking about a material stream that a large portion of it goes to disposal, you would be under the disposal reporting regs, which would talk about capturing jurisdiction of origin. And if it's on the recycling composting side, that you'd be capturing more the material type side. The fact that this is going out of state is an interesting twist because that's going to be exported material either under disposal reporting or under the recycling composting side.
A little bit more clarification. When we're talking about material types, we only report material type, as John said, in the recycling umbrella of activities that we have. And right now, the way the law sits, all of these transformation and thermal recovery activities are currently listed as a disposal activity. So we recognize that it's different, but the current structure of the law doesn't really allow for kind of a third category that isn't recycling and isn't disposal. So everything kind of has to fit between disposal or recycling, and basically if we say that it's recycling, then we can get material type, and if we say that it's disposal, then we get jurisdiction of origin and source sector. And so it's two different types of information that we would be able to get depending on where things sit. And at this time, how the law sits, those kind of activities are going to fall under disposal. So we can't get material type reported in that way. Does that make sense?
And the AB 901 reporting process is not the place where we're going to reclassify things and move them around in the hierarchy or anything else. This is strictly, we're putting some reporting things into place. Those other discussions can go on, but they're not really this is not really the place for them to make any progress.
And I'll also add that as things potentially change, you know, if something in the next 2, 5, 10, 15, 20 years change about how things are classified as recycling or composting or disposal, that will automatically flow over into 901, because if something is a disposal activity, report it as disposal. And if it changes and is described as recycling in the future, then it will then be reported as recycling. So, you know, 901 reporting will change and morph as other pieces of policy in the state change and morph.
So I want to respectfully disagree. I've been spending a lot of time with these regulations, and I think this really is a good opportunity to revisit some of these and into what's already into these regulations. I used the word gasification. I shouldn't have used that word because it's defined. It's a definition of gasification that doesn't really make any sense. But that's not what this facility does. So it's not a gasification facility in that category, and it's out there, as many of these facilities are, in what I'd consider to be an uncategorized zone under California law. And we're going to make a big policy mistake here if we do not start tracking these very positive uses of materials that enable diversion away from landfills into creating very low carbon intensity, very clean transportation fuel. We're really going to miss the mark with this thing. So I don't want to take this all. We got a lot of other things to cover. So I'd like to continue this discussion in another forum.
Thank you.
Other questions? There.
I have a few questions. I'll do the easy one first. I assume by the white goods, if somebody's sending off just scrap metal, assumably to recycling, and the white goods are in there, we don't have to count those out separate.
And if it's all mixed together, yeah.
Okay, now the fun one. AB 901 deals with the reporting of solid waste and recyclables. And household hazardous waste is excluded from the definition of solid waste. It's hazardous waste. And if household hazardous waste had been intended to be included in 901, I think many of us would have had a lot more to say about it. And I can understand your need to want some data. I like that data too when I do analysis. But household hazardous waste don't count in the 75%. So primarily, the intent here is just to gather information on how it's handled, where it goes. But I don't see that in AB 901. It's these particularly from household hazardous waste facilities, which are not disposal, they're not recycling, they're not composting facilities, they're not exporters, they're not brokers, they're not transporters of recyclables. Household hazardous waste facilities are more like a generator of solid waste, and those are not being reported. So I've looked and looked in 901. I'm confused on where it mentions being able to go after information on those waste streams. So can you clarify that?
Yeah, so if something is being disposed, if it's being taken to a hazardous waste landfill and disposed, or an incinerator and disposed, then that would just be reported as general disposal, because we don't get material type for disposal, right? So for household hazardous waste that is being disposed of in the state, that will just be basically lumped into general disposal.
Well, and
That's all we're doing. That's already reported in Form 303.
Yeah, I think maybe hazardous waste landfills aren't part of 901 reporting.
Oh.
So to the extent that
Either hazardous waste facilities.
Well, so what generally we're talking about is material sent for recycling. So if the material at an HHW facility is going for recycling, I don't know that there's anything in 901 that says do all the recycling except for household hazardous waste recycling. So that's where we're coming from, and I don't know, maybe we're wrong, but
recycling a paint or recycling a battery is not the same as recycling plastics and cardboard. Those facilities have other scrutiny, other authorities that they need to be permitted in. They're not solid waste facilities.
Well, I mean, neither is a PET flaking facility.
No, but that PET is a solid waste to begin with, or a recyclable, depending on what way you want to look at. Household hazardous waste is excluded from those definitions.
Well, I mean, I think we're willing to sort of look at it, but and see whether that's something that precludes us from including recycling of certain kinds of materials because they're classified as household hazardous wastes. I didn't think that the wording of the statute precluded us from including household hazardous waste recycling in the general category of recycling. But again, we'll have that conversation with our folks internally and see. But if you have an argument against there's nothing in 901 that precludes us from doing it, should we anyway? If you still think no, we shouldn't, even if we have the authority to, that's a discussion that I'd like to have now.
You answered that earlier with not having explicit authority to do anything on another waste stream that somebody else talked about. So
right, but if you're sending architectural paint off for recycling, it's being recycled. So that's recycling
as a hazardous
activity.
Waste process.
It's a recycling process.
So we have it listed here as one of the things that need to be reported for paint.
Right, you have it there, and I'm questioning why those are there based on the reasons I raised earlier.
Because this is a recycling.
Recycling of hazardous waste is a totally different set of regulations than recycling solid waste.
Right, and we have a lot of different set of regulations that are covered under this, and even things that aren't really regulate. For example, we have the aggregate folks that have their own set of regulations. We have composting folks that have their own set of regulations.
But those all start with a solid waste or a material that would be a solid waste if sent to landfill. They don't start with something being a hazardous waste.
There's so hazardous waste sometimes end up in landfills, right?
That's illegal, but yeah,
illegally, right?
But that's still not something that's covered in 901 as illegal reporting of hazardous waste.
Yeah, we'll look into this more. I mean, it would make our reporting a whole lot easier if it's yeah, we can't.
Easy.
But we'll look and see if we have that authority, if we can find the nexus that we need to do this, and really we'll look at this and see if there is both the authority and the need to pursue these.
You have authority for tracking household hazardous waste under the Form 303 regulations, and I would argue that's a more appropriate place to have the discussions on tracking these materials than in 901, which many of us never saw that as intended in this. Otherwise, we would have had a lot more to say in the legislature.
Thanks. As John said, we'll keep looking into this and we'll get back to the group and let everyone know where we fall here.
I mean, this is a good example of why these workshops are good, because you guys bring up stuff that we're like, okay. So thank you.
Yes.
Tom Davis, Davis Consulting Services. Yesterday afternoon, I suggested that you folks consider the inert debris that is taken to inert debris engineered fill operation not be a material covered because, as I stated yesterday afternoon, Article 5.95 of Title 14, at the end of the definition of an IDEFO, it states that that material does not count for diversion. And Robert, you suggested that we revisit that today. And so can we revisit that today?
Sure. So I think there's actually 2 points here. One of them is sort of whether a material type category should be included as a reportable material. And the other is a particular facility's process a reportable process? So is it a generator who doesn't report? Is it an end user who doesn't report? Or is it a processor who does report? Certainly, if it's a material type that's completely out, then nobody would have to report at all. So I think we take these two, one at a time. One being are these inert materials? Should we report them at all? Are they included in the system in general? These concrete and asphalt and rubble and other C&D materials. And I'm not sure if maybe you can clarify the extent of the number and types of materials that you think might be excluded or might be considered for exclusion. Are we just looking at concrete and asphalt, or does it extend into other C&D materials? Or maybe it's just concrete. I don't know.
Well, the definition of inert debris engineered fill operation lists those acceptable materials that can be taken into an IDEFO. And that includes fully cured asphalt, uncontaminated concrete, crushed glass, brick, ceramics, clay, and clay products. This is a subset of the inert debris definition in the same article, which is a subset of construction and demolition waste as defined in the same Article 5.95. So it's just more than rock.
Got it. So it's a fairly large number of material types that might be going into this process or this use of an IDEFO, certainly including some products that we wouldn't want to sort of categorically exempt out of the entire system, particularly glass. We certainly wouldn't want to. So I think we would then move into looking at the use itself, this IDEFO operation. What is it that they do? And are the operations associated with what they do something that fits into what 901 was meant to capture? So these facilities are taking material either directly from a generator or through a intermediary processor. I'd imagine sometimes it happens both ways. Sometimes they take it directly from the site, and sometimes somebody else takes it, crushes it up, and then or consolidates it and then sends it on to this IDEFO. Is that right?
Typically, the material that enters into an IDEFO is source separated by a contractor, for example, and then brought to the facility by a hauler.
Okay.
And then at that point in time, it is that recovered material is processed and placed as a construction fill. And I must mention, though, that my clients that operate IDEFOs do not take all the materials that they could take. Like, for example, they do not take brick, they do not take ceramics, they do not take clay products or crushed glass. And the reason is they are trying to meet a engineered compaction factor that those items do not allow for that compaction standard to be met.
Sure. So I think if a facility like an IDEFO takes source-separated, sort of processed material, crushed concrete or asphalt or what have you, and a hauling company brings it to this IDEFO and pours it into a hole, I think that would classify pretty neatly as the end use. As long as you're not processing it and pulling out rebar and other contaminants and sending certain things off for recycling and other things off to disposal, all you're doing is buying material in a big truck and having it dumped in a hole. That, I think, very clearly categorized as an end user.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. We have Brian Matthews with his hand up online. Brian, if you'd like to unmute yourself with *6, you can go ahead and give us your question or comment.
So just following up on that conversation regarding the inert debris disposal facility, going back to my previous comment regarding classification of waste, here you have material coming into a disposal facility. It meets the criteria for just calling everything MSW, and yet the regulations require that we speciate these materials into concrete, into other things. And if soil is mixed in at any point, then we could just call it soil. Because it was, if it's 51% soil, and it's, separated prior to arriving at a construction site or something else, this is an example. And I think, Robert, you may not understand how garbage companies and disposal facilities make money. I don't think they ever pay for material to come into their facility. They're charging somebody maybe a much lower rate, but they're still charging. I mean, there's a term in the industry called revenue-derived material. It's all revenue to them. It's not something that they're paying for.
Brian, I think that, so in the case of the, of the IDEFOs, they are a completely different type of disposal facility that is regulated under very strict and different definitions from a landfill. So it's not considered a disposal facility under 901 and would not be receiving any type of mixed solid waste other than those inert materials that were listed by the speaker here.
And that's consistent with how it's been treated in the disposal reporting system since about 2001, when that determination about those facilities was made. So,
right, but if a landfill is taking in
individual material types and mixing soil and other things, that's a very specific application.
But if a landfill is taking in material and processing it to create engineered fill, or to create engineered fill or cover material. Now we've got that dual-sided facility there, and because they're a disposal facility, we're no longer classifying the material.
Now, again, the facility has not changed its activity type, right? It's still a landfill. It still has to report everything that comes out. This IDFO is a type of facility that's more like a construction site than any type of disposal activity. It's the crushed materials are used to fill holes in the ground, and then they make construction over it. So it's a completely different situation. And in the case of a solid waste facility, a landfill, any processing that they do on site and send off for any purpose is going to be reported.
And I'll also add that anything used on site for beneficial reuse has to be reported by material type.
So it means it has to be reported coming in.
Well, it doesn't really matter how it's reported coming in. We have to, a disposal facility has two main categories of reporting. One is all of the tons that went into the hole for disposal, not by category, not by material type, just total tons to disposal. The second piece that a disposal facility has to report is tons to beneficial reuse or on site by category, meaning ADC, AIC, engineering projects, et cetera, and material type. So if you're using wood chips or concrete or tires or whatever on site for an engineering project or for ADC, you'd have to report the tons of those materials to that beneficial reuse category by material type.
And if I could add to that, if your concern, Brian, here is that people are going to use soil as a category to not pay their fees as they come into the door, the fact that they have to report it is not going to make them pay fees on it.
No, I'm concerned that by your saying that they don't have to say type of waste disposed, that you undermine the premise of AB 939's fee action, which says you have to report pay fees on type and quantity. And type is not just as disposed or MSW, it's all kinds of types.
Brian, if there's a requirement to collect information about the type of material coming into the landfill for some other purpose other than 901, the fact that 901 doesn't require it doesn't preclude a facility from collecting that information via some other requirement, or even reduce their obligation or necessity to collect that information via some other obligation, whether it be BOE or CalRecycle or any other state, local, or federal agency. So just because we don't need it for 901 doesn't mean that it disappears and you can't or won't ever have to collect it. So it sounds like
you don't think that because 901 will create the least common denominator that, hey, I don't have to report it, why do I have to track it?
Well, somebody might make that argument, but I would say it would be a poor argument. And if they have an obligation to collect certain data for some other statutory requirement and they're not doing it, then they're in violation of that statutory requirement. And pointing to some other statute that says they don't have to collect it for that particular purpose, I think would be a pretty weak argument. See, we have a question here in the room. Neil, go ahead.
To get to Brian's question, and you talked about it earlier in these workshops, there's nothing to preclude Alameda County and Stop Waste from putting that requirement on their haulers, disposal up, anybody that's making, taking materials to disposal, they could have that requirement for their own use and needs, right? It doesn't preclude any other kind of reporting obligation.
Absolutely.
It just won't be part of what's required under 901.
Absolutely.
Well, but 901 does require that we can collect the information based upon type. And so if CalRecycle is now saying, well, you don't need to keep track of type, then we lose some granularity in our ability to enforce the ordinance. And we can't pass legislation on out-of-county landfills. This is that legislation.
Brian, you said that 901 gives a requirement to collect information for landfill material by type. Where in the statute are you seeing that?
It's under the section G 2. There's those records shall be limited to weight tags that identify the hauler, vehicle, quantity, date, type, and origin of waste received at the disposal facility. So type of waste needs to be recorded for the purposes of local jurisdiction's ability to enforce or collect fees and enforce franchises. If then a landfill says, no, we don't have to keep type anymore because CalRecycle doesn't require type for disposal activity. They're like, wait a minute, you become the lead on as far as what types are captured.
All right, Brian, we have our legal team here looking at the wording right now, but while they do that, let's take a question in the room.
Natalie, Waste Connections. While AB 901 says that you do not need to report the use of clean or contaminated soil segregated, you report it to the Board of Equalization. So there is an organization that needs that information as well.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Well, and that extra authority in G that lets jurisdictions go and look at the local governments look at the records.
Look and copy.
Right. it is a step up as opposed to, well, it's not all the way to saying you have to include those in the reports that are sent to CalRecycle, but it does allow local governments to look at copies of those records.
All right, we do have a little bit of time left. I did want to bring up one of the definitions of material types that we're still working on. That's the definition of mixed recyclables and mixed compostables. This would be in the case that you have a MRF that is sending material out for recycling or for composting to a different processing facility. In order to avoid the reporting of very, very contaminated material as mixed recyclables, we have separated those categories between mixed waste, mixed solid waste, and mixed recycling, so that when you have somebody shipping off something that's very contaminated, that people don't just get to write that all off as recycling. So we've been using the threshold of 10% for something that we're going to call mixed recyclables. So for example, if one MRF is sending some material to a different MRF and it's mostly recyclable material, then they would be able to use this term mixed recyclables instead of the term residual waste when sending their material out. Any thoughts about that, Larry?
We ran into this issue many years ago. When materials being shipped out, you aren't going to know the percentage. So even on tiered permitting, where the 10% residual comes from, technically that rule applies per load coming into a facility, but it's only measured on the back end after it's been processed. There's no real way to, when you're sending it out mixed, you're sending it out mixed for a reason. You're not going to know whether it's 9 or 11%.
Yeah, and we definitely understand that. And the reason why that threshold is so low is because we want to differentiate between something that is just mixed waste and something that is really mostly recyclable material that you're sending out.
And I'll just step in because we had this conversation obviously on the first day when we discussed thresholds, and I want to sort of reframe it because it's relevant to this conversation, but maybe from a slightly different perspective. So just to give everybody some background on why we're thinking about doing this, some of the examples that were raised that gave us some pause were, so say you're a MRF and you're collecting material from the general public or businesses, and you've got this material and you're going to send it off, and it's not bales of plastic, it's not bales of OCC, it's just stuff, right? It's mixed, it's a lot of everything, and who knows what it is, but it's not segregated flows of material, and you're going to send it to another recycling facility who's going to sort it. Well, that's all well and good because they're going to sort it, and then they'll tell us how much was OCC and how much was newsprint, because when they sell it, maybe it's segregated. But if you send that same mixed material to, say, a facility in Nevada, well, now it disappears, right? So we have no idea what happens to it once it gets to Nevada. So how do we characterize that flow? Is that mixed recyclables that goes for recycling, and now it looks to the data system as all recyclable or recycled, which maybe that's a good way to go? Or do we say it's all solid waste going to a facility outside of the state and it all looks like it's disposal? Or is there some way to characterize it slightly differently where we get some information, even though we can't get all of the good information that we'd like to get from the facility as they ship out their separated, baled, marketable materials? So that's the problem we're looking to try to find a solution to. The one that jumped into our minds initially was, hey, well, if you're going to send it to an out-of-state facility, let's find a new bucket, a new category, and we'll call it mixed recyclables or mixed solid waste, depending on how much garbage is in it. And so if you're sending mixed recyclables, that's mostly recyclables to a facility out of state, we'll still get that it's recyclables leaving the state. Whereas if it's basically just a whole bunch of garbage, we don't want you to be able to get off the hook and say it's all recycled, because it's really not going to be recycled. So anyway, that's the problem we're struggling with, and maybe folks in the room have some solutions on ways that we can tackle that and find a solution that'll actually help. And maybe there isn't one, but we hope that there is. Any thoughts? Go ahead, Neil.
My thought is that most of that material that's recyclable that's going to be shipped to a secondary MRF is already processed. So calling it mixed processed recyclables or unprocessed recyclables might differentiate what's being shipped. How much recyclable material is left in that, like Larry said, it's highly differential. Typically, if it's already processed, that means the low-hanging fruit is taken out. So that material may be less than 50% recyclable material, but some MRFs have the sophistication and systems in place to get down to recovering 70 or 80% of that material that leaves a MRF. So
maybe
one MRF might be capable only of getting 30% recovery out of it. Another MRF may get another 30% out of it.
Sure. So maybe if the line were, instead of how much contamination is in it, has it been already processed by a facility versus it came straight from the generation and we're just passing it along to another facility, and we're acting more like a transfer station in this circumstance. But if we put it through our sort line and what comes out the back is now, sorted material going out to another facility, then we'll call it sorted material versus non-sorted material.
But then the problem remains that we still won't know what happens to it when it leaves, right? So how to characterize the waste in a way that's going to give us information about what may happen to it or how likely it is to actually be recycled versus to mostly be disposed, right? That's what we're trying to get at.
So that's only for material you're talking about that's being shipped out of state.
Yes.
Where that feedback loop, and I guess maybe there's some diminishing returns in trying to determine what type of a sphere or world are we talking about? How much material is actually being processed initially here and then shipped out of state for further processing, where the value of those commodities is likely to be a lot less and they're farther away from markets. So I don't know if there's much utility in trying to chase down those tons.
And maybe there isn't a lot of examples at the time, but things change, and maybe in the future that if we have more facilities in Nevada that are very sophisticated and we have more neighboring states coming online with better equipment, that may be a bigger thing in the future than it is now.
It's also a preemptive loophole closer, which we spend a fair amount of time as a state agency trying to think about potential future loopholes. We don't want to create a situation where there's an incentive to have your disposal disappear as recycling just because you send it to a facility outside of California. Whereas if you sent it to a facility inside of California, you'd have to be on the hook for the 10, 15, 20, 80% residuals that go to landfill. But if you send it to the place in Nevada, all of a sudden it's all recycling and everything's happy.
You have millions of tons of material going to China and other overseas locations. And in the not too distant past, we had Operation Green Fence in China that said, whoa, these have a lot of garbage in them. So there's some historical reason why really there's some distinction between really clean stuff and really dirty stuff that's going out. But how we track that, how we deal with it is up for discussion.
Yeah, I think you're going to have to keep it simple. Maybe that you throw out the 10%. I'm not sure how you'd ever measure it, but you're also trying to regulate the intent to send something out for recycling and unknowing whether how much of it gets recycled or the whole, what I mentioned on the first day, the serial processor, they may take 50% out and send some on for somebody else who may take some, and some of it may end up in landfill. There's no tracking on that. It's hard enough to do it in state, let alone out of state. So maybe just keep it simple between the two definitions and use that. But it's not going to be definitive anyway unless the person sending it out gets a report back, which is never a guarantee, even when you have a contract to get that information.
Thank you. So we are coming towards the end. Maybe we'll take another 5 minutes or so, and then we'll let Alonka finish up. I don't see any more questions online. No one's got their hand up. Anybody in the room got any final thoughts?
All right. Well, our next steps here is to finish up our last workshop and take all of your comments back and ruminate on them for a while. We do want you to send us written comments. They are very helpful. Our minds are not a locked vault, so please send us written comments by September 12th. Then we will work to incorporate your comments into a revised draft and aim to begin the formal regulatory process here as soon as feasible. So with that, here is our contact information. Robert's project lead on this, but please send your comments to the AB 901 mailbox so that I can look at them too. And if you haven't already signed up for our listserv, the information is here. With that, thank you very much for coming. And yes, and for the next workshop, if you are online, you'll have to, we're going to kick you off with this webinar, and you'll have to sign in for the next webinar with a different link. So we'll hope to see you there. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your participation.